Greetings once again. Tonight we've got our good friend from England, Nick Griffin. From Australia, we've got Dr. Jim Saleam and his good friend, and a very, he's been around. He's been
45 years.
Yeah, he's been around. Mark Ferguson. So I'm going to kick right into it, and kick is the active word here. It's all kicking off in the Middle East right now, Nick. Israel has conducted airstrikes on Tehran's nuclear facilities, taking out top Revolutionary Guard generals and scientists, and Iran has responded with 100 drones at Israel. That's the most recent breaking news. And so what comes next? Will Trump respond or not? And if so, how? What is the impact likely to result in the region? Who's going to be with Israel? Who's going to be with Iran? What are your thoughts?
Well, I looked at the papers online this morning, and the first headline I saw in the Daily Mail was Iran attacks Israel. And I thought, whoa, that's a bit of a surprise. Didn't expect that. And of course, it was nothing of the sort. When you actually read into it, it's Israel had attacked Iran, and Iran allegedly has responded with a very minor strike with 100 drones. So that appears to be where we are. As for where we go next, it's fascinating, isn't it? You know, logically, and for a lot of Donald Trump statements and his subordination to the Zionist lobby in the USA, you'd expect that, actually you'd have expected perhaps America would do this rather than Israel. But Trump and Netanyahu do appear to have fallen out to a degree in recent weeks, with Trump concerned that Netanyahu simply isn't going to go for any sort of peace at all. Now, the sort of peace that Trump wants to see in the Middle East isn't the sort of peace that we would like to see in the Middle East. But I think it's true that Trump does think it's a mission of his to bring peace everywhere, including the Middle East. So he and Netanyahu aren't best pals at present. So if the Iranians act with great restraint, then Trump actually will tend to favor that and will be even less impressed with Netanyahu. If they respond as they're entitled to with a massive ballistic missile strike, then Trump will get upset by that and be pushed very much to take Israel's side. On the other hand, if the Iranians don't respond with something big, then the Israelis will do it again and again and again. So you really can't predict it, because there's that unpredictable as to what the Iranians will do and the strained Trump-Netanyahu relationship. All he can say is that it's expected. You know, we've known this is coming for a long time. And it's not just about the question of Israel's security or whatever. Of course, it's also about the fact that Netanyahu has, well, the war in Gaza is sort of grinding to a genocidal halt, and Netanyahu faces being removed and going to prison for a very long time. The only way he's going to avoid that is to keep these crises rolling, to keep wars going on. So that's a large part, I think, of what's happening here and why it's happened now. So I often have a crystal ball, as you know, but in this case, it's very cloudy. I don't know what's going to happen. It certainly makes the world a more dangerous place than it was 24 hours ago. But there again, we knew this is coming. So in the grand scheme of dates, it doesn't make a lot of difference, does it? It's just a very scary time.
Do you think he's angling to try to draw Trump and America into it by creating a situation that makes it impossible for them not to?
Absolutely. You know, if this is Iran's problem, they don't respond. They keep getting hammered. They respond just a bit too much. And there's the usual pictures of dead Israeli children, because their children, as you know, are the only ones who count. Yeah. Then at that point, the pressure on Trump to act would be enormous. If Iran is able to respond with precision strikes on military targets, and what they did to the American base a couple of years ago suggests that they are, but if they're able to do that, then you might actually reach a situation, surprisingly, where in a week's time, sort of on a square all round, Netanyahu's position is a bit firmer, because he's seen Israel through this crisis. He's taken action, blah, blah. And Iran undoubtedly will be under greater pressure to reach a fairly submissive deal with the international energy people and Trump. So yet again, it might all go away, and rumours of Armageddon might yet again be, somewhat premature at least. That's I think the best that we can get out of it, and that relies on the Iranians' missile capability actually being as sophisticated as the most optimistic people think that it is. If it isn't, and they just respond with a barrage against Israeli cities, then Trump is going to be under huge pressure or have an excuse that he needs to act pretty roughly against Iran.
Jim.
Yes, look, I think we'd agree that if we go back, say, a couple of years ago, there are a number of main Israeli goals in the Middle East. One of them involved Yemen, the so-called Houthi group. Another one was Hamas, that was silly enough to do some things that it did. The other one was Hezbollah. One was Assad's government in Syria, and the last one was Iran. Each one of these has been addressed in one way or another by Israel, and each one of them has been put under. 4 of them have been, let's say, dealt with very, very roughly. Iran is the last one. It seems to come down to a desire to reshape the whole politics of the Middle East in a way that secures the Zionist regime for 1,000 years. And that seems to be the mentality of this. Turkey has been recreated as a major player, and of course the Kurds get nothing out of it as a result of the Syrian downfall. So Israel is playing its real last card that it wants to play in the house of cards that it hoped to knock over. I don't think they'll stop. Brings us back, Nick, to the point you've made about Gaza. And there are people who say, I'm strictly neutral about it, of course. And in one way, you'd have to be. You can't get involved in such a war. But that doesn't mean to say that people shouldn't know the truth. The truth of how it ended up there is something that I think most people in European-based countries need to know. And when you call it a genocide, I suppose some of those words can get misused, but essentially it's a massive war crime, whichever way you look at it. It is a massive war crime, and it's committed by the Zionist entity. And yet, a lot of, and I know you'll lead on with this as we go, but a lot of these pseudo-patriotic groups and others don't seem to see that whatever Hamas might be, the Zionist regime is even worse. It's brought on these things. And there's a willful blindness, whether it's Christian Zionists or other species of that or anybody else. It's Israel gets a free pass. And I seem to think perhaps Israel's running out of free passes. That's my comment.
Yes, well, it's you're aware of Ezekiel 38, I guess, are you? The prediction by Ezekiel about the Armageddon, as you mentioned, Nick. And it was something about prophecies that always stuck in my mind. I can't tell you why, but it has since I was about 12 years of age. But now we're feeling the consequences of the Balfour Declaration and Sykes-Picot Agreement and all the other things that transpired a century and more ago.
Okay, well, let's move on to something else here, because Nick hasn't got his crystal ball, and but that is the breaking news. Now, in the US right now, they're rioting for criminal border jumpers. In Ballymena, they are rioting against them. That's an interesting juxtaposition. So this all began over the rape of a young girl by, I believe, 5 Romanian boys, and it's led to some rioting. I only just heard about it in the last couple of days, but the police supremo over there in Northern Ireland said the police will stand shoulder to shoulder with our diverse communities. You know, that kind of sounds like a pimp. It seems they are so hell-bent on keeping intact a disintegrating system, even though the behaviour of the invaders will not change. And in places like Northern Ireland, the resolve of the natives won't either. So you're probably, you are definitely more informed on this.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. What's...
Well, first of all, again, an interesting thing in terms of the way the newspapers spin this. All the British press is presenting the trouble in Los Angeles as protests against immigration restrictions, whereas what's happening in Ballymena and other places in Northern Ireland now are riots. So there you go. The same thing's going on. Petrol bombs thrown at the police, but in one case it's protest, thoroughly legitimate, and the other it's just moronic racist thugs. Well, the incident that sparked this, there's been a lot of trouble. Ballymena has gone from being basically 100% indigenous to being at least 5% ethnic in the last couple of years. They're piling these people into Ballymena, which is actually it's the heart of the Bible Belt. It's a very, very strongly Protestant and religious place. Thoroughly decent people. But of course, the working class community there is uniquely in the whole of Western Europe. The working class communities of loyalist Northern Ireland are actually organised and united. They have especially the marching bands. So a town like Ballymena, I think it's got 4 marching bands, really high quality things. So you've got young men who can respond to orders, who know each other, and a community that supports them and has a very strong sense of identity. And into this, they put, in fact, a large number of Roma gypsies, and the tensions have been going on quite some time. Came to a head when a young local teenager was allegedly orally raped by 2 young Roma gypsies. So they say they're Romanian, but of course they're not. And it all went bang. Now, again, it's been going on the last 6 months at least. There have been a number of instances where foreigners misbehaving themselves have been what they call put out. So people have just come and knocked on their door with a handgun and said, right, you've got 40 minutes, get out. And they've gone. This has been happening in various places. But the Ballymena thing is a whole different level. It's already spread to probably now the majority of other hardcore loyalist towns where there's a significant number of recent incomers being billeted amongst them. And it's really very, very tense over there. Now, the police act very toughly. They got near riot shields, water cannons and so on. Anywhere else, certainly in Britain, that would do a lot to suppress, the anger and keep people off the streets. Doesn't work in Northern Ireland. They're used to it. Their dads used to do it. Their granddads used to do it. Their grandmas used to make petrol bombs for their granddads when they were kids. It doesn't bother them, that sort of confrontation. So when police chiefs, especially if they bring in foreigners, outsiders from England, when top cops start saying, we're going to stop this, we're the ones who rule the streets, that only incites it, inflames it still further. So it's got a long way to run this yet. And the really interesting thing is, of course, that the Irish, because people certainly in America, they look at this and say, oh, good for the Irish standing up for themselves. This is not the Irish. This is Scots Irish, who aren't Irish at all, in their heads at least. But the proper Irish in the other parts of Northern Ireland and in the south are looking at this, and they're that far from being forced to take a message. They've been marching and protesting against these asylum billet centres, what they call the new plantation. They've been marching for several years against it, protesting, and all the elite do is spit and curse at them and take no notice. So the Irish are now a whisker away from following the example of the Northern Ireland loyalists and turning to direct action. So the whole of Ireland's got the potential to go up in flames, very, very quickly on a staggering scale. And it's really, that wouldn't be a good thing. Innocent people get hurt when that happens. And from a British point of view, if Ireland goes up in flames, we'll get about 200,000 extra unwanted males of military aid, completely unvetted refugees turning up on our doorstep through Liverpool and Glasgow. So I don't want to see it, but this is the last chance saloon now, not just for the Northern Irish elite, where actually most of the foreigners will quietly go away over the next few weeks. They'll simply move out. But in Southern Ireland, where there's been really an invasion over the last couple of years, this has got the potential to set them alight, and it's their elite who are in the last chance saloon to say, okay, we understand the public anger, we'll stop any more, and we'll set about sending back the ones who shouldn't be here. If they do that, the place will stay calm. If not, Ireland could have a very long, hot summer.
Jim, do you have some perspicacious comment?
Yes, I know Mark is waiting to give some anecdotes about Sinn Féin, so I won't go into which territory. But I remember last year during the so-called riots, as you said, Nick, not protests, but riots that were in the Republic and also in Ulster. There was an academic I saw on a program. He's a lecturer at a British university of Greek background. And he said one of the most remarkable things that has not been commented upon by all of the official commentators was the fact that there was a movement directed against migration north of the border and south of the border. And in the north of the border, it spread across the Catholic areas into the Protestant areas. And it was a universal protest, he said, of immigration. And he said, what I saw was the thing that deeply concerned me. He said it was like a unity by common ethnicity against people perceived as third world people from the outside. And he said it wasn't commented upon. Has it been commented upon, and what does it mean?
It still hasn't been commented upon. This wave of riots at the present or protests are exclusively in the loyalist areas. And they've got the thing, their paramilitaries are either neutral or pro the protesters. Whereas, as I gather Mark might talk about in a bit, in the Catholic Republican areas, that what's left of their paramilitaries are hardcore Marxists and pro-immigration. So it's a bit harder for the lads to take to the streets in, say, Catholic West Belfast than it is in the Protestant areas of East Belfast. But the key thing, one of the protests last year in the centre of Belfast, they had an anti-immigration march, as you're talking, and they had tricolours and Union Jacks held side by side by marchers who regarded each other as friends and comrades. And that would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago. So yeah, this indeed, there's a very ancient Irish prophecy which was turned into a song by the folk rock group Planxty about how there'd only be peace between the Red Branch Knights, which is the fighting men of Ulster, and the Gaels when they finally unite to face a common foe. And that's pretty much where we're facing now.
Mark, you must
I've been to Ireland twice, Dublin twice, haven't been for a long time. And you'd be familiar with where this is, Nick. And you cross the Liffey from section 1 for you two lads. Dublin's divided into 1 and 2, basically. And I remember walking to this building just on the left-hand side when you cross the Liffey there, and it was full of Chinese. I nearly fell over. But apart from those Chinese I saw in that building, and they were doing something with immigration, I never saw one coloured face on the 2 occasions I was there. So then we move on. Is it Mary MacDonald, who's the head? Is that her name? Head of Sinn Féin?
Sinn Féin head, yes.
She was there today, standing shoulder to shoulder with a cabal of about 100 people saying, "You're us. We support you." And it's just, and for someone who was as old as myself or you people, we know what Sinn Féin did. And one wonders what the captain would think with the Easter uprising about what Sinn Féin has become. It's just, and I've actually given them 2 calls, and I've let them have my mind. And the last time I did it was several months ago. The woman who answered the phone, she says, "Oh, if you were here, you'd be in jail saying that." I said, good. Oh, one other thing, have you been following Professor David Betts's things about the Civil War in Britain? Have you been?
Yeah, I've been following that. Yes, I have indeed. Coming back for a minute, how long ago were you in Dublin last?
Oh, look, I haven't been to Dublin for 18 years, but I was there 20 years ago.
So now Chinese will be the least of your worries. Huge swathes of especially inner city Dublin are now more African than they are Irish. It's a truly shocking thing, and it's causing a great deal of tension. And you know the Irish are just as ready to kick up and stand on their hind legs and fight as the men of Ulster are. So I do think that there's going to be big trouble, which brings me to your question about bets. Yes, I've seen this as a very level-headed assessment of the situation in Britain. It parallels, by the way, there's an opinion poll in France just the other day. 49% of all people in France now are quite prepared to tell a pollster that they think that France is on the brink of civil war. Not the civil war might happen in 10 years' time or 15 years' time when that lot grow up, etc., and there's more of them. The brink of civil war right now. So it's not just Belfast or Dublin, it's the whole of Britain and France and other places as well. Are very tense. So
I'll just interrupt you because Jim and Nathan might know who Professor Betts is. So could you explain who he is?
I'd rather you do that because I don't know particularly well. I haven't looked at him closely for a reason I'll tell you in a minute, but carry on.
Okay, well, Professor David Betts is from the London School of Economics. He's a Canadian. He's lived in Britain for 25 years. He holds British citizenship, and he's been warning it. And I'll forward you an interview that he had with Andrew something or another. And he's been saying it for a number of weeks, that it's just inevitable that there will be a civil war in Britain, and it will come to pass because of the division on race and culture. And it's, none of us are surprised about that. But one thing for you, Nick, because I mentioned it to both Jim and to Nathan, in 1978, I met the great English raconteur Quentin Crisp. And Quentin Crisp was telling me, I remember it's clear as bell where it was, he said, I was in favour of immigration, and he said, but it's not working. And he gave me a saying. He said that immigration is the impetus and the nemesis of societies, and Rome and Constantinople proved that to be correct. So that's a quote from him.
Oh, interesting. Right. So coming back to Betts, it's interesting you say he's from the LSE. The LSE was created as a Fabian think tank to push Britain in a socialist direction, and it operated very effectively in that way, really a revolutionary force for many years. In recent years, the LSE has changed somewhat. Its leftists have dropped all their sort of social class Marxism and turned it into the green Marxism of net zero and destroying capitalism through that critique and through state action over climate change. And in doing that, they've become extraordinarily close to Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is basically a front group stroke ally of the Rockefeller Foundation. So this is part of this merger between the old Marxist left and the hyper-capitalist right. And the LSE is at the very center of that. The LSE, I did a study a couple of weeks ago, actually, that the LSE is perhaps the key force which has pushed the whole European Union down the net zero road. It's a very powerful thing. So when someone comes out of that school, and closely allied with Chatham House, who've also been pushing this line, saying, the civil war's around the corner, wake up. It's the Muslims, people, watch out for the Muslims. Now, I've been Britain's greatest Islamophobe by reputation. I was the one who criticised and spoke out, first of all, against the grooming scandal and connecting this to Islamism and so on. So I am not a friend of Islam. But when people from powerful positions, and there's various journalists in Britain doing the same thing, the story about the French being thinking they're on the verge of revolution came in the Daily Mail from everything said in it correct, but the author is a hardcore Zionist. So when hardcore Zionists and people who come from this globalist think tank milieu start telling the British people that, oh, watch out, you're on the verge of civil war, I have to wonder, is it because they actually have suddenly woken up and they actually care about us and our people, or just because they want us fighting mad against Iran? And that's my problem with this. So everything Betts has said is right. I agree with him. But there is a tendency, not all, well, for a start, we're not, if all our immigrants were Sunni Muslims from a radical position, I would say absolutely, definitely, we're on the verge of civil war, which is actually where I used to tend to stand. The more you look, and the largest number of immigrants who come into Britain over the last couple of years are Hindus. Working class Hindus, probably over 1 million of them in the last couple of years. So if we're going to have a civil war, it's not going to be just between the Brits and the Muslims. For a start, well, you're more likely to have a civil war between Muslims living in Britain and Hindus living in Britain than anybody else. The next biggest wave of migrants coming in are Ukrainians and Africans. Now, again, I've got all sorts of problems with those people coming in, but they're not going to be part of a simple two-sided them and us civil war between us and the Muslims, because the Muslims and the Africans tend to hate each other. So all these warnings are correct in a way, but I have to wonder about the motives of the people pushing them and the way that they're constantly directing us in one thing. Just think about the Muslims. And especially say Tommy Robinson is part of this. He's open. He's openly said he's said for several years, we should open we need workers, we need immigrants. We should open our borders to the Hindus, let them all in, and we should mix with the Africans who are here.
Is that what he says? My God, yeah.
That's absolutely what he says. Now we could have 40% of Muslims in this country for the next 1,000 years. And as long as they were in their places and we were in ours, the British people, the English, etc., would still be here. If we have one generation following Tommy Robinson's advice and the advice of all the great and good thinkers who come from these milieus, people like Niall Ferguson and so on, for instance, one generation of mixing with the Africans and the Hindus, they say are absolutely fine, and we cease to exist. So assimilation is annihilation for our people. And all these people, their answer to this is slam the door shut, don't let in any Muslims, and assimilate with all the others. They're not on our side, I'll tell you that.
No,
well, Dr. David Bull, I think his name is, he's the new secretary, David Bull, he's the new secretary of Reform. He got out the other day and said, and you may not be aware of it, Jim and Nathan, he said, we've always been a migrant country, and he fell on the floor.
Yeah, saw that.
Yep.
Well, can I say that it's not an opportune time for England or France, for that matter, to fall into civil war, because they've got to defend Finland from
Russia.
Yes.
Oh, that's right. I know. Very dangerous, those Russians, mate. They've got an army that's invincible, but they seem to have lost a couple of million being killed in Ukraine. I've heard these stories. Sorry.
But I have noticed that is the kind of malarkey they're cranking out still in and amongst Putin's finished, Putin's army, over 1 million dead, this sort of things. That's just in the last 24 hours, the sort of stuff I've seen. So they're really trying to encourage us to go and, die for NATO there. Let's talk about Ukraine. Where is it at right now? How far from the finish line is Putin?
Do you mean the Finland line, or do you mean the finish line? Which one?
Yeah, that's very witty there, Jim.
Thank you. I'm just being sorry.
I do believe they're both spelt the same way too. Yeah, finish. We're going to hang out our watch from the.
Yes, I think Putin will just carry on grinding away. There is talk of a much bigger offensive being developed, and certainly the Russian army is thoroughly capable of it. The media stories about 1 million Russian dead. If that was true, then there'd be about 8 million Ukrainian dead or wounded, for the simple reason that everyone, all the military experts accept, and they constantly complain about, because we're not giving enough money to them, that Russia has a superiority in artillery and drones at the rate of about 8 to 10 to 1. And it's artillery, and drones are basically its modern artillery, which since the First World War onwards has always caused the vast majority of casualties in conventional warfare. So you cannot possibly have an advantage of 8 or 10 to 1 in artillery and yet be suffering 8 to 10 times more casualties on the other side. It's a patent nonsense. So I think what we know for sure from this is that the Ukrainians have indeed lost at least 1 million men killed and wounded, probably well north of that, as a matter of fact. And that therefore means that Russia almost certainly has lost 150,000 men killed and wounded. Now, considering the British Army is basically about 80,000, that means the Russians already lost two entire British armies. Not an army as in the Army of the Rhine or the Army of the Middle East or whatever, the whole of the British military. And since the British Army's effective fighting strength, when you take out the poor fellows are there with no legs because they lost them in a minefield, but they're now working behind a desk and so on, or the ones who are so old and unfit and fat they can't fight, the fighting strength of the army is not far above 40,000, the British Army. So the Russians have lost nearly fourfold the entire fighting strength of the British Army already. That's actually a fact. And yet still the Russian army is now stronger and more effective. And again, the experts say this, they're the #1 army in the world. They're blooded, they're trained, they're highly efficient, they've got fantastic kit. And yet these lunatics and criminals, which includes not just Ukrainian former ministers, but our own Prime Minister in Britain, saying that British mothers have got to get used to the idea that their sons are going to go and fight and die for Finland and Estonia. It's utterly monstrous. The good news is that although Middle Britain, especially older Middle Britain, tend to take an anti-Russian, it's from the old Cold War days, they tend to be instinctively anti-Russian, anti-Red and so on. Not one of them would give a penny, let alone the blood of one of their sons or grandsons, to that war. And the British government and the whole elite are saying we're going to have to have conscription. Tell you they've got zero chance of imposing
Funny
that.
how they balance that duality of bullshit, isn't it? On one hand, saying Putin's finished. Now, quick, hurry, because Putin's about to attack Finland. And I don't know
more than that, he's one of these latest spokesmen said that unless we stop him, we'll have to learn Russian. Unless we give up our National Health Service and our pensions and put it all into arms and go and fight, we are going to have to learn Russian. I mean, it's a staggering thing that they will be marching through London with snow on their boots next week.
Yeah, I prefer that to. Now, what about that big attack the Ukrainians supposedly made on this airfield? I heard reports that it was just pretty much planes that the Russians had put out to field anyway. They were.
It's something to do with a treaty with the United States. Both sides have to reveal these type of aircraft so both sides can film from space, apparently. And therefore, the Ukraine government would know exactly where those planes were. And that tends to indicate they received some sort of intelligence from NATO.
But were they significant planes, or were they?
They appear to have been. And
they appear to have been, and this is why, they were so far back, they were 2,000 miles away from the front line, so that they can pop up, be used if they want to with long-range ballistic missiles, and then they're entirely safe. So I think it's consistent with, yes, they were genuine. If you think about it, the militaries of the entire world must be looking at with horror now at their own airfields and so on, because you can hide all sorts of things. You can hide tanks, you can hide ballistic missiles in silos. You really can't hide warplanes, which have to take off from an airfield and come back to an airfield, and anyone living near it can see how many there are, what they are. And they're now extraordinarily vulnerable to this thing, which is just cheap drones. And those drones weren't expensive. There was nothing fancy about them. They're basically drones that you could buy to film a backyard or film a sport you want to do, and put an explosive on them, and one of those will take a plane out. So it is a new form of warfare. I think the important thing here is that how much damage the Ukrainians did doesn't really matter in a way. We know that the Ukrainian intelligence services lie, and we know that our media happily repeat their lies. So almost certainly they've exaggerated it. Yeah. It doesn't matter how many planes they've struck. The fact is they've struck, or how important they were, they've struck targets 2,000 miles behind the lines, and the Russians didn't see them coming. So this means one of several things. The attack which the Ukrainians carried out against Putin's helicopter can only have been carried out with NATO support because of the intelligence required. This attack on the airfields could conceivably be carried out by the Ukrainians without anyone else knowing. Bluntly, if the IRA had had drones back in during the Troubles, then number 10 would have had huge holes blown in it because they nearly succeeded with a lorry with homemade mortars and gas rockets parked in Whitehall. They nearly succeeded destroying down the street like that. If they stopped exactly where they wanted to, instead of skidding slightly because they hadn't allowed for the weight of the lorry, they would have destroyed number 10 completely. So it's possible that this attack was actually carried out by the Ukrainians without anyone knowing. If it's the case, then the West have a partner who is utterly unreliable and utterly irresponsible, because a strike on a chunk of Russia's nuclear deterrent is the equivalent to a nuclear strike, or the preparation for a nuclear strike on Russia, and the Russians could easily have responded with a nuclear strike. They still could at some stage. If they feel their nuclear capability is being degraded, then why would you wait until it's been completely degraded? If you're going to have a nuclear war, you have it while you're at peak and not leave it too long. So if the Americans and the Brits didn't know the Ukrainians were going to do that, then they should think these people are so mad and dangerous, we must drop them like a ton of hot bricks. If, on the other hand, they knew, but Trump didn't know, then that means the CIA, the American establishment, are keeping their commander-in-chief in the dark. And that's also extremely dangerous. Personally, I believe that Trump didn't know. I think it's entirely possible that the American intelligence didn't know, because I think that that attack would have been carried out with the help of the British military intelligence, in the same way as the effort to drag America in Obama's time into war against Assad was via the White Helmets, which is MI6, which is Britain. And Britain is not an innocent little partner being dragged along by wicked Uncle Sam in this case. When it comes to Russophobia, then Britain is the senior partner in this madness.
Very historical. I was going to say too, Nick, it's very interesting that at the moment there's a dispute between Australia and the United States over this so-called AUKUS treaty, and Australia, United States and the UK, and about the building of nuclear submarines and so on. This type of defence, you've raised a very important point that any yob watching us tonight would certainly get, is that military defence depends on ballistic missiles, drones, different types of warfare techniques. Our country has been committed to $1/3 of $1 trillion in purchasing useless submarines, which are only going to be part of someone else's navy anyway. Trump's ordered a review. I understand, I don't know what the position is on the ground in Britain from patriotic people and others, but surely Britain investing massive amounts of resources in nuclear submarines, how does that really defend Britain? And against what does it defend Britain?
Indeed. The common position is, look, they're probably lying to us. These people can't even defend our borders at Dover against some boats, let alone defending us against anybody else. It's emerged in the course of the Ukrainian conflict that even our ordinary missile batteries, the more elaborate ones, can't be fired unless the Americans want them to and provide the coordinates, etc. So why on earth anyone would think that the Americans have supplied us with a nuclear deterrent and left it independent so we could use it without their say-so, it would be very, very naive indeed. So we've already got a nuclear deterrent, which is actually simply, it's an American thing proxied out to us. So we take, we're dragged in and we take the blame too. And to expend more money on that would be utterly monstrous. It's part of this conceit that Britain is still a hugely important world power, which, to be simply honest, we're not anymore. We're a rather poor third-rate power, and the more money we spend pretending to be first-rate power, the worse our plight gets.
I'll follow on from that, Nick. How bad is it in Britain? Because I watch lots of YouTubes, and because you're not there, you can never really get a first-hand realisation. So how bad is it?
What do you mean, bad in what sense?
The sociological, economic situation.
Well, the economic situation is grim. You talk to anyone who runs a small business, a builder, a pub or whatever, they're all utterly desperate. But for people below that level, they either got a job or they know if they don't have a job, they'll probably do better off on benefits anyway. so they're not too fussed. People higher up the ladder, they're feeling the pinch, but they've done pretty well. So most Brits are still, they're somewhat concerned. They don't like this government at all, but they don't really understand, just how bad things are, because for them, they're still not that bad. But it's, the underlying thing is that this country is a demographic basket case, like most of the West, not just the West, actually, like all the industrial world, and that nothing that we still regard as normal is going to be standing in a few years' time. There was a staggering piece of statistics I saw the other day, which is that talking about the plight of Rachel Reeves, the utterly incompetent Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, whose policy decisions have had a disastrous effect on the economy. But apparently, if the demographics of Britain, it's just the age structure, the proportion of people working and not working, were the same as they were in 2013, then she'd have, I think it's something like £80 billion more coming in taxes. So she wouldn't have a black hole at all. So quite apart from the Labour Party's incompetence and the shambles they inherited from the Conservatives, the core factor is that the pure demographics of our ageing and retiring population is that any government, regardless of whether they're competent, highly competent, or grotesquely incompetent, any government would be facing an 80 billion black hole compared to one 18 years ago, just because of the demographics of this country. And that's the hidden crisis, that while they're all looking at all these other crises and thinking about spending all this money on utterly useless submarines, they're letting this crisis just brew and get even worse for the future.
I just want to say something about the demographics in relation to Australia. And our politicians, we've got to spend more money on defence and defence and defence. Well, that's all good and well, but we have a fifth column of around about 1.8 million people directly linked to the People's Republic of China. And we have 365,000 international students from China. And going back in 2008 at the Olympic rally, Beijing financed 10,000 international students from China to descend on the rally and confront the Free Tibet protesters. So what you're saying is, what's the good of defending them when you've got a fifth column which will destroy them?
That's partly it. Bear in mind that when I talk about demographics, and what I've just been saying there, everyone on the right thinks when we say the word demographic, it's a code word for immigration, them outbreeding us. In this case, that's not what I'm saying. It's not the case at all. This is just about our population collapsing as all us boomers start to die off, and we simply aren't replaced by anybody unless the elite have brought in large numbers of, Pakistanis in our case, or Chinese in your case. But so it's actually two different things. We shouldn't conflate the two. But again, I agree with you completely that what is the point of having a massively expensive defense system when huge swathes of your own country are already ruled in street terms by others?
Correct.
It doesn't actually matter doesn't matter who they are. The fact that they are others and they're potentially faithful to others. I don't know how many Hindus you've got, for instance, in Australia. I'm sure it's a significant number and rising.
890,000 Hindus.
Right. Okay. So that's quite a lot. Now, if you'd gone back 20 years, that would have been a population of people who basically just wanted to get on and make money in their corner shops and so on. So from an ethno-nationalist point of view, you wouldn't want them there. From a strategic point of view, they're not really an issue. You can say, well, at least they're paying taxes, some of them. So that was it 20 years ago. Now, Indian communities all over the world are being rapidly radicalized and turned into a fifth column, or if you want to use a more polite expression, a lobbying group for India, and especially a very militant, very economically aggressive Hindu India, which sees itself as being the next world superpower, because they look at, although the Indian birth rate is now at basically non-replacement level, but they're far, far better off than the Chinese are. So the Indians have somewhere between an ambition and a fantasy to be the number one power in the world later on in this century. And as part of that, they are consciously Indianizing, Hinduizing, and making more militant every Hindu population in the world. And I'm sure that the money they're pouring into radicalizing Hinduism in England, in Britain, is being mirrored by what they're doing in Australia as well. So you've got a special problem with the Chinese, obviously, but geographic, historical reasons. But there's other issues, other problem groups out there as well.
Well, in Sydney, as Mark well knows, we worked on it recently. There's a city, an entire city being built around a Western Sydney airport. And no one's quite sure. We've done a lot of investigations. You can't get to the bottom of who is exactly going to build it. But it will be for well in excess of 100,000 people. Most of these people, not all, but most, are from the subcontinent. Therefore, most of them will be Hindu backgrounded people. Mm-hmm. And there's also, I might have raised it with you, the ethnic cleansing of an Australian population from a well-known suburb in Western Sydney called St Mary's. And they will be replaced, a huge urban development for about 20,000 odd people, again, drawn probably 90-10, the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia and from India. These are entirely new developments. We have a former Prime Minister, a man called Tony Abbott, who brought up this idea, and Mark's written on it, that somehow or other Hindu India will be a great balance against a communist China. Therefore, you open up to an immigration program. I mean, this is mad stuff, but the Indian diaspora may pass the Chinese group in Australia within the next few years. There are Hindu nationalist groups here which are actually armed, but they arm not with guns, they arm with various forms of sticks. They're paramilitarised, and they have been identified here. Our famous suburb, you've probably heard of it, Parramatta. It now has statues of Gandhi everywhere, and he's regarded as the folk hero. There's a park named after him and all of this. These things all emerged in the last few years. Mark's written on them extensively. So
what we were so dependent upon China, and I've written articles called "Out of the Wok into the Pyre," and when
that's a good one. I'll pray that.
I'm glad you laughed. And when you laugh, and when they realised China was detrimental, probably about 2010, they started to, go and get China, get India on side to come and save us, and that alliance, because they got this thing with they're going to be one of the countries who defend us against China. Well, hang on, India is a staunch member of the BRICS and the founding members of the BRICS, and also it has a strong allegiance with Russia. There's about as much chance of India defending us and fighting Russia, maybe with the Himalayas, which is a separate issue. So good luck about that.
Indeed. It's very significant stuff. I think that obviously in the UK, we're looking at that military question again. In Australia's case, Australia is more isolated, more, let's just say, closer to areas of global contention. But we're obviously defending ourselves against the wrong enemies. In Australia's case, there's actually a historical literature going back to around the turn of the century, the last century and just after, that said that a lot of people talk about civil contention and everything, but there was a literature here that said that Australia was actually a continent on which one day we may witness warfare. I remember when I first entered the sphere of Australian nationalism, I somewhat discounted that. I could see threats from the outside and limited intrusions into Australia, but not anymore. I think Australia is a continent that could actually become fought over, and it would be fought over by people who, at different points of time, our governments are regarded as allies. Obviously, the US maintains its bases and things. India is yet to come. We've written extensively about the Northern Development in Australia plans. China's got a lot of those plans too, and Australian riches are there to be taken. And but our government plans for to fight the Russians. I don't think the Russians are a problem. I think they're a little bit too far away.
Sure. I think that one thing that our masters managed to forget, because there's a guilt from their class, at least with this, is the fact that you think, well, the Chinese and the Indians, yes, they've clashed and so on, they don't like each other, they got border quarrels, but they could easily be united in a way by the fact that both of them feel that they were the victims of monstrous Western imperialism. In the case of China, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Yeah, in a way, true.
With the Opium Wars, courtesy of Britain, America and France.
Yeah.
In the case of India, well, you've got the Bengal famine, things like that. You know, we stopped them burning their widows on funeral pyres, built the universities, built the sewers, built the railways, etc. But believe me, they really are not grateful in the slightest. So there's, although they have an internal quarrel between each other, there's an awful lot that unites them in terms of if they could do the white man down, they'd be highly delighted. And you, by extension, in their eyes, are basically Brits. You fought for Britain, etc., etc. And then there's the factor, yes, in parts of the Himalayas and so on, they got a limited border quarrel. So if you're a Chinese or an Indian strategist, who's your real enemy? Well, if you're sensible about choosing your enemies, your enemy is someone whose defeat is possible and makes a real difference to you. And for China and India to think they can defeat each other is a nonsense. They can fight each other to a standstill. They can inflict appalling damage on a limited amount of border where really, apart from national pride, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference whether the border's 100 miles this way or 100 miles that way. They don't really gain anything other than possibly a rather significant subjugated and hostile class who are going to be kicking up against their occupation for years. That's all they gain by fighting each other. On the other hand, if they fought or went into Australia, or even fought each other over Australia,
yes,
they've got something really to gain. So cruelly and harshly and materialistically, Australia is the proper enemy in terms of someone you can defeat to benefit from for China and for India. And they might, on account of their anti-colonial past and resentments, simply say, tell you what, we'll split it down the middle, like Portugal and Spain split the world down the middle back in the 15th century.
Well, I can't see any of that happening because we're talking about Temu, for instance, Temu. You know what I'm talking about when I say Temu. They're an online Chinese retailer of the worst junk you can possibly imagine.
Temu,
Temu, yes. No, we are honestly primed to believe that there is much more dynamic, that these countries are much more dynamic than they really are. You know, China has a great facade of that, yet behind the facade is the same crumbling that we're experiencing in the West and everywhere else. The same malaise that accompanies this post-industrial, digital age, spiritual decline has beset these countries. And, the competence that we once had in the West it's not there in China or India. Obviously we have a lot of corruption in the West, but there is a particular sort of corruption in the East that just will just guarantee, will keep it from ever being able to rise to these absurd ambitions. I think we're past all that. Frankly, I have a great feeling of decline throughout the world, and I don't see anyone particularly rising above it. At the same time as we have AI, at the same time as we have some of the most remarkable technology, we've got a sort of dark age right beneath it, complete and utter moral deterioration.
I agree with you entirely. I agree with you entirely there, because this came back from my point, so it may kick in on this. I agree with you entirely. Again, the crux of it in China and all the rest of us, it's a culture of death, a refusal of life, and it's a demographic catastrophe. It's a demographic black hole. I thought when you started talking about a retailer, you're going to say China won't do that because they want to sell things to the Australians. I was going to say in 100 years' time, there virtually won't be any Australians.
Correct.
The population is going to be half of what it is now at the end of this century, if you're lucky, in terms of native. That's just the way it is. Can't be turned around. That's the demographics. But one thing, you're right about this general malaise throughout the whole industrial world. I'm sure you're right about their incompetence, but this general malaise, people in the end sort of won't accept it. They'll kick back against it in the way that the end of the Roman Empire was sort of ups and downs, and various emperors came to power, promising to do something about it, and some of them turned it around a little bit. This can't be turned around. You will get that sort of thing in all these countries. You're going to see a sort of a nativist backlash type thing, basically, for want of a better word, a sort of fascism. I'm using it in a neutral term, just an actual fact. Yeah. You'll get fascist strongmen, Trump, Orban, perhaps even Putin. They're sort of examples of what's going to become more and more common. And a fascist strongman in India or China, for all the incompetence, might indeed be inclined to take the advantage of a very weak Australia in order to, even if it's not realistic, even if it's not sensible, to make his people feel really something special and to go and loot some resources, then why not? And however incompetent they are, I don't think they're probably not going to be any more incompetent relative to the modern best of the West than, say, the Japanese were in the early 1940s. And with bicycles, the Japanese conquered half of Asia for some years. You don't have to be that competent. You had to have a strong leader and a nation which is at the end of its tether and wants to go and kick some ass. And that I still think, I hope you're right, but I still think it remains possible.
But don't forget, they conquered it and then lost it. Just the same as Hitler. There he is, conquers the top, bloody Europe, and then he's just sort of like a butterfly fart in the wind.
But the Japs only lost it because the Americans had lots of young Americans and an enormous military machine.
Oh, and they also overstretched in the Pacific. I mean, they came all the way.
There's like an uneven, like that famous phrase about the uneven development of capitalism, but there's an uneven decline of powers, I think is what Nick was saying. And in this uneven sense of decline, sense of entitlement and whatever, China could be in a demographic decline, is in a demographic decline, but still has the incredible amount of resources it could precipitate it into that war in Taiwan or something along these lines. And in the case of Australia, India, as you said, Nick, it's reached that edge. It's now at ZPG. It's starting to dip below ZPG. That doesn't mean to say that in that process, that uneven decline down from 1.4 billion to 1.2 billion to 1 billion, you can field a lot of soldiers if you have a population, I'm speaking colloquially, of 1 billion. Of course you can. You will have the massive resources to engage in imperial contest. Australia, like taken as a corporate thing, if you look at it that way, Australia can be divided and subdivided even by the gangsterism of multinationals. A long time ago, there was a chap in Australia, we know who he is, his name was Keith Winshuttle, and he died very recently, and he wrote a lot about the false nature of the claims made that British colonialism in Australia mass murdered Aborigines and all of that. And he said, no, that's not right. But in his earlier life, he'd been a type of leftist, a type of political economy style leftist. And he actually predicted that Australia could be subdivided even by multinational corporations and global banks into zones where different people would be predominant, where governments would become weakened, where the most powerful people would be the corporate bosses. All of these things are possible here. You said before, Nick, you might not have come with your crystal ball tonight. I'm trying my best to make up for it. But a lot of people in Australia have said this in the past. Australia could even be colonised again, but from the outside completely. It could be colonised from Shanghai, from New York again, from other zones.
I put it to you like this. Who colonises a Westfield shopping centre? And that's pretty much Australia's an airport with a lot of
airport.
It's just a big open.
Well, that's what Keith Winshuttle said.
What is to conquer when you can just, when you've got the money, you just buy the bloody farm, etc. There's nothing to. It's conquered demographically. It's all.
That's right.
Sold off. I don't see these alarmist, militaristic.
No, it doesn't have to be, mate. That's what Keith Winshuttle said. He said Australia would be colonised by being a great export platform, He said, with its brothels and its centres of entertainment open 24 hours a day and cowed by a paramilitary police force. And he said the whole world can get a share of this paradise. They don't actually need to invade you because they have invaded you. And so Australia, I think we can look at it from a number of points of view, but the value of Australia is enormous. We found recently shale oil here in Australia, enough to run the entire world for hundreds of years. Australia is a cornucopia of wealth. If one army invaded, it never was stupid enough to use nuclear weapons here and toxify it or something like that. You'd lose the golden calf. You wouldn't do it. So Australia could be one of the enormous victims of this emerging system of New World Order capitalism.
Don't worry about that, Jim, because it all sits on native title land.
I know, and the United Nations says that they can't have it. I hate to tell our black friends this, but you're in for a very rude surprise. But we've been telling them that for 40 years, and I remember one Aboriginal spokesman said to me that if you ever thought you could get a hearing from any Aborigines, you're insane. And I do hear that some of them do say it now. They've realised that this native title didn't work out either, but that's another story.
Can I get your opinion, Nick, on the road, the renewables in Britain? Like I know people who come here and they tell me power bills are just beyond the pale.
Yeah, it's crazy. And people's power bills are between £300 and £1,000 a month.
A month?
Yeah. So for a big family home and so on, especially in the winter time. Yeah, entirely. It's incredible. We see our landscape literally desecrated by giant windmills and so on. And I don't know to what extent you people followed the blackouts in Spain. Last month,
yes,
it was a staggering thing. When I first saw that, I thought, well, it's a little bit odd because the power's gone out in Spain in the middle of the day in the early summer. I was always expecting the power to go out in Spain and Britain and everywhere else, which is relying on wind and especially solar. It would come on a grey February when it's still. We get weather like that. February for us is very grey. It can be very still. So no sunlight, snow all over the place covering solar panels, and no wind either. So I was expecting the power to go out then, and instead it went out, as I say, on a late spring morning in Spain. Why? And it emerged it's because real power stations, whether they're run by coal, gas, electricity, or whatever, the hub of them are giant spinning wheels, which involve huge amounts of inertia. And the inertia means that these things can withstand sudden surges up and down in the power supply. Apparently, all the renewables, obviously they don't have this. It's just from the solar panel to the batteries. It's from the motor and the gears of the wind turbine to the batteries or to the grid. But they don't have these wheels. They have no inertia. And therefore, even a small disturbance in what's being produced means that one shuts down. And the minute that plant shuts down, or that transformer shuts down, it upsets the next one. And they shut down in a cascade. So the experts are now openly saying that this is a problem that no one really saw coming with renewables. They don't have this inertia. They're so fundamentally unstable that they will crash, even when the wind and the sun are actually producing enough power for our needs. So they really have sold us a pig in a poke, which, of course, if you look at the aims of, it's not just the World Economic Forum, the people at the London School of Economics, they're really quite open about it. The World Economic Forum are open about the fact that they believe that we must shrink our carbon footprint, or rather that they must shrink our carbon footprint, not that of the rich, because there's not many of them, not that of the third world, because they don't use much power, but us in the middle. So they're open about that. And the NSE climate change net zero people are quite open about the fact that this is the best way to destroy capitalism. So yes, these people, they're not pushing us on to renewables because they want lots of renewable energy. They want to push onto renewables so that we don't have large amounts of reliable energy at all in order to grind our society down to their sort of pastoral vision. It's like I like the old Allied plans for the pastoralization of Germany at the end of the Second World War. They now plan this for the whole lot of us. So don't for 1 minute think these things are renewable. They're never even meant to be.
Yes.
Okay, gentlemen, as we begin to wrap this up, I just want to ask you one thing, Nick. Did you see that video recently of Keir Starmer and I don't know who the two other clowns were, but they appeared to be having cocaine, and I've got the video.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
What the hell's with that?
nothing would surprise me. Nothing would surprise me. There's also a rumbling scandal of, I don't know if you know about it, but you need to look into it if you don't. Keir Starmer and the three very pretty young Ukrainian builders.
Yes, we've been following that.
Village built for YMCA builders. It's a very strange affair. Quite simply, either Keir Starmer was the victim of an asymmetric terrorist attack by the Russians, which should be huge news, or he was the victim of an asymmetrical terrorist attack by the Ukrainians, which should be huge news, or he employed some Ukrainian builders to do work on his house, his other house, because he didn't want to use Brits because all British builders hate him. And if he did that and then had a falling out about the bill, and then that would also be huge news. Or he was having very inappropriate relationships with three little twinks, which would also be huge news. It should be huge news. And our media has it zipped.
And that's the thing that got me, Nick. What you said and all these suggestions, it wasn't big news. That's the point.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
It is. And especially that cocaine thing, because it was as plain as bloody day. I've got the video. It's like clearly doing the old
something.
and you think, well, that says a whole lot. I mean, they just come back from cocaine from Colombia. They've just come back from bloody Ukraine, where obviously Zelensky's just like laying out lines of Bolivian marching powder as thick and as long as a python, an Amazon python. And you want to know, wonder these bastards are all mad as buggers, isn't it?
I think you're probably right.
Well, look out, because it's my prediction the Azov battalion's going to take the place of the village people. I think anything's possible.
Did they actually have they actually ever fought in that war, or have they been kept back like
the village people?
No, they've been used cynically by the Zelensky clique in the war. You know,
they were very brave in was it Avastal, the defence of that Verdun-style fortress that they had earlier in the start of the war. Very brave in defence of that. Since then, as I understand it, most of them basically have been the commissars, the political officers of the army as a whole, which is one reason that the army has fought so incredibly bravely against such incredible odds. That's basically they're not that different. They hit the youth in 1945. They're extraordinarily brainwashed. And when they're finally defeated, Europe will have problems with, crystal ball now, Europe will have problems with Ukrainian narco-fascist gangsters for 30 years. When those people are defeated and end up in the West, because what else would they do? And they'll feel betrayed and used by the West. Let's face it, they have been used by the West.
That's absolutely correct.
They were betrayed.
There was once a book that I read a long time ago about this narco. You used the term, and we'll use it very generically, narco-fascism, coming out of Central America and manipulated by the CIA in the late 60s and early 70s. I've got some book about it by some lefty, but a lot of it is actually somewhat true. And what you said, Nick, has been predicted by others too, that there'll be a big problem, also a problem for patriotic and nationalist-minded groups in Europe, where you're being attacked. You could actually be physically, violently attacked by a criminal gang programmed to behave in a certain way. It's not a good look. In fact, if peace does come to Ukraine, obviously migration is going to have to be so strict in Europe that Ukrainian people can't migrate.
They can. They can migrate to Russia.
Well, there's a lot of Ukes who think of themselves as Russians, but the borders would have to become very sealed. I know a lot of the Poles say that, even though Poland has been somewhat of an ally to Ukraine. But it's a major problem. I mean, any war that's unleashed, the biggest problem often is the detritus of the war. And I know that a lot of Democrats talk about, look what happened with fascism after the First World War. But what did you really expect? Do you expect the Freikorps to go home? They didn't want to, they went on to bigger and better things in their minds. And it's the same with these fellas. You can't just send them home. It's impossible. So we've got a problem there.
Indeed so.
Well, gentlemen, it's always really good to talk to you, Nick. You're as fascinating as they come. Humble too to talk to a nitwit like me.
Thank you, Nick.
I find that, inestimably gracious of you. And thanks for
You're
joining.
very welcome. It's always interesting. Great, great speaking with you. Always interesting things I didn't know before. So I should look forward to joining you again. Until then, I will remain most humble.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
please say hello to you, Dave, for me, and I'll have a better camera next time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.